So good morning, everybody. Greetings. Bonjour. Hola, bienvenidos. Bonjour, bienvenue. So as John said, my name is Allison Outhit, and I've been in and around independent Canadian music for over 30 years. And for a long time, I worked at a major music funding institution, and it gave me some insights that led to the founding of the Alliance for Equity in the Music Industry. And equity is what I'm going to talk about today. Specifically, the notion of equity as an antidote to colonialism and ethnic nationalism and white supremacy in Canadian cultural policy. It's almost 10. I don't think it's too early to talk about white supremacy. It's Monday morning. Let's go, team. But wait, isn't Canada all about diversity and multiculturalism? That's what's on the poster for sure. When you take a dive into the history and the jurisprudence and the governance of Canadian cultural policy and find out who's really paddling the canoe, it's, I don't know if you can see this. It's the white guys. This is a photo from the front page of the Toronto Star on July 11th, which is the day I started to sketch out this speech. And it reads, Canadian Rush Hour. And it's 3 white guys in a canoe. So the international delegates to G20 will probably have a sense that Canada's cultural activities, in particular our export activities, are very well funded by our government. And in fact, the government proclaims our music funding system to be the envy of the world. Well, I've been thinking about systems. And first of all, it's in the nature of systems to self-preserve. Systems want to keep going. And all of the elements in a system will serve the continuation of that system until something changes it. And when that system is white supremacy, it will keep acting to self-preserve until a disruptive force is introduced and tips these guys out of their canoes and then blows up the canoes. The canoe, by the way, is a top 5 Canadian icon, and it is metaphorically and literally my subject today. But first, as we stand on the banks of my speech ready to launch, I want to acknowledge that my home is on lands that for millennia featured endless beautiful forests and fast rivers and lands that were hunted and fished and gathered upon and traversed by Haudenosaunee, Wendat, Anishinaabe. And then about 250 years ago, just a few kilometers from here actually, French trappers built a trading post. And then 10 years later, it was burned to the ground by the British, who claimed the land as colonial settlers, and they never left. The land where my home is became subject of the Toronto Purchase, also known as Treaty 13, between the British Crown and the Mississaugas of the Credit. That treaty was pretty much like all British treaty undertakings, entirely sketchy, and it came under scrutiny for its sketchiness by the Crown itself almost immediately. But, systems, they kept it going until the treaty's legalness and value were challenged by the Mississaugas in Canadian courts in 1998. And in 2010, the government of Canada settled the claim and paid the Mississaugas of the Credit something like $145 million in compensation for the loss of their lands, including the street where I live. So I'm mindful of the First People, and I'm grateful to live here by their grace. Chimigwech. Back to the canoes. When Canada declared itself a nation in 1867, 2 things were true. Thing 1, the Canadian government carried on the genocide of Indigenous people that had been ongoing since European settlers first invaded these shores. The people who'd not been killed by violence or disease or starved or deprived or poisoned were rounded up into camps and subjected to systemic cultural genocide. That was the explicit policy of our founding fathers, and it lives on today in many, many forms, notably the continuance of Section 88 of the Constitution, also known as the Indian Act. And that particular piece of legislative cancer is a law that the government of Canada conferred upon itself, all by itself, giving itself the unfettered right to dictate who is and who is not Indigenous, how Indigenous people live and what they eat and where their children are educated, and who governs their day-to-day affairs, and where they can live, travel, marry, work, and so on. And the Indian Act is living Canadian law. And it sets out the processes and the techniques and the systems of the cultural genocide that are even right at this moment causing profound ongoing harm to Indigenous people. And everything that we have and everything that we are as a nation is built on top of that toxic truth. And that's thing 1. Thing 2, At the time of Canadian independence, there was no national identity. There was no shared history. There was no shared folklore, no mythology. The land itself was stolen, and the people from whom it was stolen were being eradicated, and you're left with Anglos and Francos. And culturally speaking, those two were chalk and cheese, fromage écrasé. The idea of Canada as a nation was initially only a political construct. But this was the 19th century, so a time when the mythification of nations was on the rise. France's revanchist ideology, which was about proclaiming an ethnic French nation within the Republic, or the political consolidation of states that became Germany and Italy, on this sort of misty idea of Germanness and Italianness. And in fact, this is the roots of their eventual crypto-fascism, and they're present in the idea that a nation must be more than just a political union. Nations are made from one people with one culture. And that's the groundwater of ethnic nationalism that Canada's first cultural policies are drawing from. And in the case of Canada, it's sort of two people and two cultures, French and English. And in this talk, I'm going to talk mostly about the English and leave the French to their side of the solitude. The federal government first got involved in cultural policy in the 19th century, and they were about establishing and funding museums and galleries and archives, all with that nostalgic commemorative purpose that's the hallmark of national myth building, and expressly to look back as if to some ancient and illustrious past that in Canada's case was actually like last Tuesday. This would have carried merrily along had it not been for the invention of radio. And the birth of telecommunication and the regulation of those industries has been under federal jurisdiction as a matter of nation making since the first Wireless Telegraph Act in 1905. So cultural policy is defined as government measures which are taken to encourage or protect activities in areas defined as cultural, which include both artistic expression and mass culture that we associate with mass communication like broadcasting, film, book and magazine publishing, TV, digital media, sound recording, the music business. Encourage and protect. And for this talk, cultural policy is about the measures the government takes to encourage and protect the music business. So let's ask, what culture is being encouraged? What culture is being protected? And what's it being protected against? With the advent of radio telecommunication, Canada had one shot in its mind to encourage the idea of a national culture and to protect our cultural nationhood and our little baby cultural industries against the United States. So what would that culture look like? Mostly British. The ruling class that dominated Canadian politics and government brought their inherited British aesthetics and preferred art forms, but also their classism, colonialism, and racism into cultural policy from the get-go. And that's what culture is being protected. And that's whose interests are being protected. Culture meant classical music and opera and theater and ballet in the British and European traditions, and in exactly the same way that those white ruling classes used racist immigration policies to protect themselves from the Chinese and from the Sikhs at the turn of the 20th century. They protected their new nation from the art and culture of non-British, non-European people. They used cultural policy to encourage the growth of industries out of their own culture, except for the bits that they appropriated from Indigenous people to suit their narrative, mythologizing colonization through fur trading and mounting, and yes, portaging in a canoe. And that British-European bias got a good 50 years to really settle in. In 1949, the federal government launched Canada's first comprehensive review of cultural policy, the Royal Commission on National Development in the Arts, Letters, and Sciences. Said the government, it is in the national interest to give encouragement to institutions which express national feeling and promote common understanding and add to the variety and the richness of Canadian life. And representing said variety and richness, they appointed as chair Vincent Massey, who was a white lawyer of English heritage, plus another white lawyer of Scottish heritage by the name of Mackenzie, and a white Francophone Dominican priest, and a white but Swiss-born engineer, and also a white lady historian, so all of the shades of white from ivory right through to bisque. They developed their report in 1951. This is the Massey Commission. And the gist of it was that without aggressive federal funding, what it described as authentic Canadian culture would be drowned out by American popular culture, which was everywhere all the time. And it does not, for the record, describe what such authentic Canadian culture looks like, nor did it have anything to say about cultural diversity, apart from a few paragraphs on Indian arts and crafts. The recommendations of the Massey Commission became foundational in the establishment of many major cultural institutions, including the Canada Council, the Canadian Film Development Corporation, which is now Telefilm, and it was cited in the establishment of the Canadian music industry and the federal musical policy of the 1970s. More importantly, it planted in the social contract the notion that government funding of arts and culture is essential to the national welfare, that government can and should engage in encouraging and protecting culture and cultural industries as an exercise in defining what Canada is, in creating our national mythology. So while all this is happening for that 100 years, Canada has a labor and population deficit. So it's encouraging immigration under the government's much advertised policy of multiculturalism. And since the 1960s, we've invited waves of multicultural new immigrants who are African, Black, and Caribbean, Indian, Pakistani, Latin American, Filipino, Chinese, Korean, and other people of color. And multiculturalism, according to Canada.ca, is about ensuring that all citizens keep their identities, take pride in their ancestry, and have a sense of belonging. But the culture bureaucracy, the decision-making, the apparatus for whose culture should be protected, whose culture should be encouraged, remains stocked with white people. So let's look specifically at the Canadian independent music industry. As always, technology is the disruptor that changes everything. And in 1954, we had a perfect storm of the transistor radio and a boom in commercial radio broadcasting, and then the actual baby boom. So popular music is being beamed into every home and business and vehicle in Canada, and an awful lot of it is American content. And then in the 1960s, the baby boomers hit their rebellious teen years, and you have the world's attention on the American intervention in Vietnam and the Woodstock generation, and all of this created the perfect environment for Canadian artists with a kind of poetic, anti-war free spirit sort of bent, like Joni Mitchell and Neil Young and the band. But still, there was no meaningful domestic music industry in Canada, so that's forcing artists to move to the States, or at least to sign with American labels. So in the late 1960s, a few luminaries in the nascent Canadian music industry came together to lobby for incentives and protections that would help grow the industry for homegrown music. Those efforts were spearheaded by what are now industry legends like Stan Cleese and Bernie Finkelstein. And at first, they focused their attention on the broadcast industry. And in 1968, the Canadian Radio Telecommunications Commission, the CRTC, had just been commissioned. And it was tasked with regulating Canadian airwaves. At that time, radio was the single most influential purveyor of music. And so the effort to build a domestic music industry started as a partnership with Canadian broadcasters. And then in the 1970s, you saw the adoption by the CRTC of Canadian content regulations, like CanCon for short, and in 1974 and 75, the foundation of the Juno Awards and the Canadian Academy of Recording Arts and Sciences. Now, given all of this expensive investment, there was still a shortage of music being recorded and released in Canada. So the Foundation to Assist Canadian Talent on Records, which is now Factor, was launched in 1982 as a private foundation. And it was owned by a couple of private radio broadcasters with the specific goal of providing funding for Canadian artists to make and release albums. But then in 1986, the Liberal-led federal government came out with a policy to support original Canadian sound recording and to grow the music industry by the sound recording development policy, and it selected Factor to administer much of that funding. And that relationship continues to this day, with Factor acting as administrator of most of the Canada Music Fund, which is the instrument of the Department of Canadian Heritage. And that's the government department responsible for designating Canadian cultural policy and spending the corresponding federal budget allocations to encourage and protect. But meanwhile, Canada's cultural industries, namely film and television producers and the music industry, successfully lobbied the government to further encourage and protect their interests as content producers by making it a requirement for broadcasters to contribute a portion of their revenues into Canadian content development. And this is where we get the Canada Media Fund, which funds domestic film and television production to the tune of about $350 million a year. And on the music side, we also have radio broadcaster funding, and it's an obligation under statutory law. It's set out in regulations made under the Broadcasting Act that private Canadian radio broadcasters are required to contribute a portion of their annual revenues towards Canadian content development as a means of supporting and developing Canadian artists in the Canadian music industry. And some of that is administered by Factor or its Francophone counterpart, Musique Action, and also the Radio Star Maker Fund, and some of it goes to the provincial music industry associations, and some of it goes directly into local or national music-focused eligible initiatives that are selected on a discretionary basis by the broadcasters. And all of this results in a very well-funded music industry as a matter of Canadian cultural policy. I estimate, I don't know, it's got to be at least $80 million a year in combined government and government-mandated radio funding that supports Canadian artists and record labels and artist managers and distributors and music publishers and event producers and festivals and presenters and conferences and export showcases and industry associations and on and on. However, if you look closely at who's interacting with the decision-making and the governance, you'll see the same gatekeepers over and over again. Not only the same concentrations of privilege, who are older, white, and male, but also literally the same people who've been gatekeeping the funding all of these years, and in some cases also benefiting directly from it. There's a reason why genres like folk and rock have dominated the governance and funding landscape, and consequently, they are treated preferentially by conferences, business models, critics, and exporters for so long. The lion's share of public funding for the music industry is administered not by a disinterested bureaucracy, but by boards of directors made up of business owners that are still rooted in the tastes and outlooks, if not the actual families, of the founding fathers of the 1970s, the folk rock people. Meanwhile, other genres of music are semi or completely ignored, regardless of their market potential. But consumer tastes have changed, and these artists and genres no longer reflect the actual market for music. Consider hip-hop, which arises authentically and is a primary expression of Black culture. It's also the most popular and widely consumed genre of music on Earth. And in Canada, hip-hop represents at least 40% and growing share of Canada's music consumption dollars. Oh, and we've also produced the world's single biggest selling artist in the world, who is also a hip-hop artist. Canada, and most notably our music center here in Toronto, has a significant African diaspora population and an abundance of thriving Black music genres: rap, soul, R&B, reggae, dancehall, house, Afrobeat. But the Black music industry, Black-owned music businesses, and those working with Black artists is an outgroup in terms of expertise and employment and access to funding and export opportunities and representation on boards and so on. And compared to its value as an economic driver in the music economy, the infrastructure for Black-owned music is significantly underdeveloped. Why? Well, the short answer is racism. The long answer is because as a matter of cultural policy, administration of music funding is handed over to the industry itself without objectively informed, skilled, comprehensive, and strategic oversight on the part of the federal government. The Canadian music industry has built structures that prefer and prioritize, encourage, and protect the same types of artists and businesses that have been familiar from the outset. It's the self-perpetuation at the systemic level. And the Canadian music industry from day one excluded Black artists and the Black music industry, leaving it comparatively impoverished and it continues to do so to this day. And in exactly the same way, for the exact same reasons, the industry is neither a welcoming nor a generous space for other kinds of marginalized artists and businesses, whether they're indigenous, racialized, queer, transgender, disabled artists, and other businesses have all had an uphill battle that's not equitably offset by access to power, access and influence within the many beneficial structures of the Canadian music and culture industries. I spoke about Factor and Radio Star Maker. They're private, not-for-profit corporations run by boards of directors. The boards make the decisions about the kinds of projects they fund, the kinds of programs they support, and crucially, how to be eligible. The rules for eligibility are established by the directors based on their expertise, their inside knowledge of the industry, their own business models. In other words, based on their interests. And they're nearly all white people. Since 1986, Factor's had one Black board member, plus 2 or 3 people of color, and not all at the same time. Radio Star Maker has a similar track record, minus the one Black person. These funding organizations draw their board members from the executive ranks and from boards of other organizations that govern the cultural industries, associations like the Canadian Independent Music Association or the Music Managers Forum or Music Canada or SOCAN. These organizations are staffed and boarded predominantly by white people, and often the same people bounce from one board to the next year after year. The most significant music funding in the country is structured to be a closed shop. That's Factor, and it has 11 board members, but 9 of those 11 seats belong to existing organizations that just appoint whomever they like. Only 2 of those board seats are elected outsiders, and those seats turn over very slowly. In fact, Factor right now has a board member who's 9 years into a 6-year term. Factor defines itself as a public-private partnership, and Radio Star Maker is a private fund, even though in both cases, 100% of their funding is contributed as a matter of public law, as a matter of Canadian cultural policy. And 100% of their funding comes with a mandate that it should be used for the benefit of all Canadians. But you look at the staff, and you look at the governing boards, and you look at the funding results, which overwhelmingly prefer white people genres of music like indie rock and alternative rock and art rock and folk rock and just plain old folk, meaning white people folk. And you know there's no meaningful public oversight of the expenditure of these public funds. There's no cultural lens and definitely no equity lens being applied there. Canada's major federally funded arts and cultural institutions, not just music, but the CBC and film and television and fine art and dance and theater, all of them are dominated by whiteness. Whiteness in their staffing, in their governance, in their programming and funding. And at the CBC, right this very minute, there are no Black members on the 12-seat Board of Governors. There are 10 white people, 1 Indigenous member, and 1 person of color. The value is white. The lens is white. So multiculturalism might be an effective lure for immigration, and it looks good in the marketing. But the ironic truth is, guess the one place that Canada definitely does not support multiculturalism? In the freaking culture. In the systems that I've spoken about here, the funding hasn't been spread around like manure, encouraging all sorts of young things to grow. Rather, it's been applied sort of like Roundup to protect that one crop that everyone is growing, that we've come to accept as a staple. The funding system encourages and protects a monoculture, and it is growing white bread. Canada's cultural policy was born in a time of ethnic nationalism, a time of colonialism, and it's a political philosophy that says a nation must have a monocultural myth. We've been fed that same monocultural myth the whole time. And like just last year, I went to a Canada Day event at the embassy in Paris. They closed off the street and they put up an interactive display of all things Canadian. So they had a maple syrup stand and a hockey rink, and they had a Mountie on a horse, and they had a teepee. And of course they had a canoe. And this goes on because it's expedient and because change is hard, and because some of those boards and bureaucrats have been playing a very tight defense, protecting that monoculture. But it's our government, and it's our money. And if we want all those beautiful things to grow, we need to change the power and the governance in culture funding. We need to face down that whiteness and that white supremacy in cultural policy, and we need to demand equity and reparations. And we need to bail out of this stolen canoe. And once everyone's included, we're definitely going to need a bigger boat. Thank you.